Well, hello everyone. You know the saying, the best laid plans of mice and men. Well, wait a minute, maybe you don't know the saying, because whenever anyone says that saying, they never finish the saying. So I had to look it up. And it says, the best laid plans of mice and men often go astray. Actually, it's in Gaelic, it's a Robert Burns poem. But our plans went astray. So this past Tuesday, we wanted to have an in person meeting so I could present this. And parts of St. Charles, I think, got up to 11 inches of snow, and they closed the library, and the roads were not good. So in the afternoon, we decided, let's do a Zoom. Okay, that went well. Not everyone got the word, but there were people on the Zoom. We even had one person from as far away as California on the Zoom, and she was a friend from one of the round tables in the western part of Missouri, so got the word for that. And it went well, except we forgot to record the Zoom. So, you have to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. So here we are, but we're going to present tonight Camp Butler. I've titled it The Chaotic, Controversial Concentration Camp because it was chaotic and there is some controversy. So here is our agenda. We'll talk about how it was established. We'll talk about the precursor to Camp Butler, which was Camp Yates. We'll talk about the initial camp and how it expanded later. We'll talk about the training regiment of all the Illinois regiments that trained there. We'll talk about the prisoner of war camp that was there, the cemetery, and then the establishment of the National Cemetery, and then what's happening today. So those of you who are Civil War amateur historians like I am, you know about April 15th, 1861. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 100,000 volunteers. This, of course, enraged some of the border states and led them to secede, specifically Virginia, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Illinois' portion of that was 6 regiments of infantry. And so immediately 6 regiments for immediate service. Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War at the time, sent this to Richard Yates by telegram. Richard Yates, the governor of Illinois at the time. Well, unlike some of the states of the Union, especially in the South, there were no organized militias at all in the state of Illinois. They had to create these from scratch. So there was no Jefferson Davis Rifles or Tallapoosa Grays or Louisiana Tigers or any of that. Illinois had to very quickly stand up these 6 regiments, and they had to do it from scratch. They had no means to do it. Most of the troops that would end up at Camp Butler would be from central and southern Illinois. Others would train up at Camp Douglas, or they would train in their counties of origin and bypass these training camps. So if you look at a map of Illinois, this line here, it's not exact, but roughly speaking, this is somewhat how the population was divided in the state. Now I think that line shifted even more northward toward Lake and Cook counties. But you had Camp Butler in Springfield, and you had Camp Douglas up in the Chicago area. You see Cairo down south. A lot of the troops from both of these camps would go to Cairo. We'll talk about where they went from Camp Butler. But before there was a Camp Butler, they established Camp Yates. Remember, they thought this was going to be a short war. So they established Camp Yates at the old Sangamon County Fairgrounds. It was 4 square blocks. It was commanded by John Pope until John Pope said, hey, I'm a commander of this training camp. I ought to be a brigadier general. And they said, no, you're not going to be a brigadier general. So he shipped out with one of the first 6 Illinois regiments and took command of it. Well, Ulysses S. Grant was in command of that camp for 4 days until they gave him the 21st Infantry Regiment, which formed in Mattoon, Illinois, but went through Camp Yates, and then Grant very famously took that regiment over to Quincy and across into northwest Missouri there. So 6 regiments were formed there. Others went through there. They very quickly realized, though, that this was not going to be a big enough footprint to train all these units. When they started to realize, this is not going to be a 90-day war, it's going to take some time. So a little trivia, though, before we get into that further. I can find no record of the 1st through the 6th Illinois Infantry. So if you know of this, leave us a comment in the comment section. Say, well, yeah, Greg, the 1st through the 6th Illinois Infantry were this, this, and this. But the 7th through the 12th Illinois regiments were all initially 3-month regiments. They later all converted to 3-year regiments. You can see where some of these other regiments formed, and it's interesting. The 17th that formed at Peoria, Illinois, went to Quincy, Illinois, then went to St. Charles, our hometown here, and then to Warrenton, Missouri. The 18th was at Aurora. The 19th started 4 companies at Camp Yates, and then they went up to Chicago to Camp Douglas to match up with the other 6 companies from their regiment. The 20th formed at Joliet, and like we talked about, the 21st was formed at Mattoon, and Ulysses Grant took command of it. The headquarters, and I'll show you guys on the map where that was, the headquarters where Grant commanded from for 4 days, where Pope was initially, it still exists, but the house has been moved. So if you go to 119 South Walnut in Springfield, that is the house. It's still there. That was the headquarters for Camp Yates, so John Pope set foot through those doors. Ulysses S. Grant set foot through those doors. I wonder if the people in that neighborhood even know what that house is or what it represents. But next time I'm in Springfield, Illinois, I want to go to 119 South Walnut and check that out. Well, there are problems with Camp Yates. One, it's too far from the rail lines. Everything moved by rail then. It's too close to town, and it's too small. It's not big enough to train all these units. There was a paper written in 1938 by a young lady named Emma Eliza Parrott. And of course, she says, well, it's about the good citizens of Springfield were upset because of the prostitutes and the saloons and all that. Well, I don't know what evidence there is for that. Here's the problem that really happened with Camp Yates. If you look at this map, it's 4 square blocks. Bounded on the north by Washington Street, on the west by Lincoln Avenue, east by Douglas, and the south by Governor Street. That building in the upper left corner is the Dubois School, and it's in that quadrant that the house was that was the headquarters that we just talked about. Well, it's 4 square blocks, okay, and we know that 6 regiments were formed there and trained there and shipped out. So that's 6,000 people, plus horses for the officers, plus wagons, etc. Think about the sanitation there. I won't go into too much detail, but the sanitation of 6,000 troops in 4 square blocks, the good citizens of Illinois probably were not too happy about that. And you just don't have room to maneuver. By the time you put your tents and you put your headquarters building and you put all that, it's hard to maneuver a regiment on that footprint of ground. So the solution, let's move the training camp east of the city limits. Let's find some ground. Now, we're going to talk about Camp Butler, but here's the dilemma for Camp Butler. Most of the records of the training camp were stored in the hospital building. I don't know why they were stored in the hospital building on the grounds, and it burned to the ground shortly after the war. Here's where the controversy comes in. I think it served a lot of people's purposes for those records to be burned. So we'll talk about that in a second. But in 1938, when Ritt wrote to the Adjutant General of the state of Illinois, the Adjutant General says, "Dear Sir," and he's writing to Mrs. Goldie P. Opitz, and he says, "Dear Sir." So that tells you the level of competence of whoever's doing this. In compliance with the request contained in your letter of April 19, 1938, the following information is furnished. There is no record of a history ever having been written pertaining to the establishment of Camp Butler, Springfield, Illinois. However, there are enclosed copies of available reports and statements relating to that camp, which might be of help to you. The returns and morning reports of Camp Butler are incomplete, and no reports for the period prior to February 1862 have been found. However, I have copied the names of such officers shown in the returns and morning reports available. There is on file a map showing the location of Camp Butler, and if you desire a photostat copy made, advise me, and such a copy can be obtained from the Quartermaster General's office for 25 cents. For your information, I wish to advise you that the Civil War records are not filed in the World War Division, but are filed in the Old Records Division and are in another building. Permission was given me by the Adjutant General's office to go to this building and search their records for the information requested, and the time to do this searching and typing took me off my regular work 3 days. In other words, I was so put out by this, and woe is me, and it's terrible. And here you go. So, 1938, Eliza Parrott wrote her master's thesis for the University of Indiana, and she wrote it on Camp Butler. And she found out most of the records are gone. And this is all retyped from records and letters that they found when they searched the archives in Illinois in 1938. And they say, oh, there's no records, but somehow this story survived, about Old Man Smoot, who was a wealthy farmer, and he took some cider, and the boys had great fun with it. And the apples fell out, and they got the apples, and he left, and it was just wonderful. Like, this is in the record, but records of what POWs came in, how many, what were their names, where were they from. The accountability for that is lost, but somehow we've got some story about apples here. Well, it doesn't seem to pass the common sense test to me. So let's talk about what they call the first Camp Butler, which was really just later the camp was expanded. I don't think there was a first and a second Camp Butler. I think there was a small area that they expanded to a larger area. It was named after the state treasurer, a guy named William Butler. He picked the first site near Clear Lake. There's various histories. The 1938 paper says Edwin Stanton accompanied him. There's no evidence that Edwin Stanton was ever out there. And that William Tecumseh Sherman accompanied him out there, and that Sherman named the camp. Well, this is just not true. The camp was operable in August of 1861. Sherman didn't get there till October. He was there. He was on a tour of inspection of recruiting facilities and mustering in and training facilities. He was there, but the camp was already up and running. It was already named Camp Butler because the guy who picked the site decided to name it after himself. That first site was really never much more than a tent city. It was 252 acres. William Butler had been a state legislator with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had boarded at his house. James Shields had challenged Butler to a duel because Butler was involved in the Lincoln-Shields duel, and Shields didn't like some of the things that Butler said. He was one of the floor managers in the 1860 Republican Convention that nominated Lincoln, and he happened to own land around Clear Lake, and he happened to pick that area for Camp Butler, land that he owned. Well, gee, doesn't that make sense? And his son has a connection to St. Louis history. He helped facilitate an arms transfer out of Jefferson Barracks to some of these units in Illinois. Big controversy about all the arms transfer with Jefferson Barracks, the arsenal, etc. His son would help the federal forces get some of those weapons. So Ozias Hatch writes a letter to the St. Louis Journal, which is now, or Illinois State Journal rather, which is now the Springfield State Journal Register. And 30 years after the fact, and he said, oh, Sherman was greatly pleased, and at once he made the location, named it Camp Butler. Well, Hatch was there after the camp was founded, and he toured it. I think Hatch may have wanted to attach some importance to this, and by using Sherman's name. The spring 2023 edition of Illinois Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society refutes this. They had placed this marker in 2011, and if you look at the second sentence there, or second line, it said, selected by state officials and Brigadier General William T. Sherman, and it was placed by the Illinois State Historical Society. Well, we know now that that's not true, and so it's interesting how history, how new research will new things to light. So the first Camp Butler, really the initial Camp Butler, was somewhere around the area of Clear Lake, Illinois. This is a few miles east of Springfield. An artillery company from Camp Yates goes out there initially. On August 6th, the Egyptian regiment, I presume from the Little Egypt area of southern Illinois, comes up there to train. August 7th, several cavalry companies move in. By August 21st, there's 5,000 troops, and 70 companies had started to move in there. They quickly realized that this facility of this several hundred acres was not going to suffice either, so they had to expand it more. So here's the expansion. You have this initial area around Clear Lake to the lower right, and because we don't have records, I don't know exactly where the surveyor stakes were, but this is based on what I could surmise from some of the narrative. This is what I kind of think the Camp Butler footprint looked like. So you've got the parade ground where the Roselawn Memorial Park Cemetery, which is a civilian cemetery, is, and you've also got the Oaks Golf Course and Country Club down there. You've got a modern day large mobile home park right in the middle. And the current National Cemetery is on the north end of this modern map. And the Sangamon River bisects the whole camp. So they expand to high ground near to the Sangamon River that gives them 350 more acres. The modern cemetery is 53 of those acres. It's near the Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad, which is today the Norfolk and Southern Railroad. Eventually, 80,000 troops would train there, and 200,000 would move in or move through or muster out there. Most of the Illinois regiments would be involved with Camp Butler in some way, either passing through from Camp Yates down to the south or mustering out the opposite way. Here's kind of a contemporary map of Camp Butler. You can see where those barracks are. You can see where the cavalry training area is, and you can see where the original Camp Butler is there on Clear Lake. And Clear Lake is shown much smaller than the footprint that it has today. On the upper top center of the map is what's called Jamestown, which has now been renamed Riverton, Illinois, which is my hometown where I grew up. So Camp Butler was designed to accommodate 8 infantry regiments at once, plus cavalry, plus artillery, enough barracks to accommodate 2 regiments, plus some tents. And the average unit would spend 2 months at Camp Butler. Here's a description of the barracks: 120 feet long, 15 feet wide, 8 feet high. Just, you can picture some Army wooden barracks. They haven't changed much in the last 100 or so years. 3-tier bunks, and so a company could be housed in those barracks. It's the second largest training camp in the state of Illinois. So Camp Douglas in Chicago was larger, and at one time or another, 38 regiments of infantry were mustered in and trained there, 4 regiments of cavalry, 5 batteries of artillery. At the end of the war, June 19, 1866, after the end of the war, it officially closed for training. The hospital was there a few more years. It's in one of those hospital buildings that the records allegedly caught fire. Ninian Edwards II, he had a different middle name than his father, Ninian Edwards Sr., but he was awarded the commissary contract. And that the records, official records, say the food was sufficient, even if it was boring, but it was nutritious. We're going to talk about that official record here in a second. Abraham Lincoln meets Mary Todd at Ninian Edwards' mansion at a dance. Ninian Edwards is Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law. Edwardsville, Illinois is named after his father, and his father has a connection to Missouri. If you ride at the Black Walnut Trailhead on the Katy Trail, you'll see that connection where he did some negotiation with some Native American tribes in St. Charles. He'll be accused of malfeasance also at Camp Douglas. So let's read what Jesse Dubois, who the current out Camp Yates, that school is named after him, what William Butler and what Ozias Hatch, all 3 Illinois luminaries in the Republican Party, have to say about Ninian Edwards. They write to their friend Abraham Lincoln. President, dear sir, and again, this has been retyped. I don't know where the original is. As we predicted, Joel A. Madison, under a contract made between Ninian W. Edwards Commissary on the one part and Dr. Fowler and Mr. Goodall of the other part, is now in person furnishing subsistence to the troops at Camp Butler and claims the right to do so at the other encampments in this state, mostly meaning Camp Douglas up near Chicago. We again insist that this outrage against common decency be corrected. We protest that Mr. Edwards is not or ought not to be permitted to make such contracts, and we respectfully ask that he be assigned to duty elsewhere and be required to contract directly with honest men, and not indirectly with thieves and scoundrels. It could be a retyping error. So these 3 men are saying Ninian Edwards, bad guy, should not be in charge of this food. Let's talk about Camp Douglas, because Ninian Edwards also the commissary there. Illinois regiment starting with the 39 infantry and up, trained at Camp Douglas. It's a strip mall and it's a housing development today. 12,000 prisoners, Confederate prisoners, are sent there. 7,000 of them are buried in a mass grave in Oakwood Cemetery. This is the largest European descent mass grave in the Western Hemisphere. You know, I don't know if Cahokia Mounds or some other Native American burial sites are larger, or maybe some in Central or South America, but this is the largest European descent mass grave in the Western Hemisphere. And I say, does it remind you of anything? Because those of you who have been to Alton and seen the Confederate cemetery there, very similar, an obelisk and all these names. So now think about this. 7,000 of 12,000 prisoners die at Camp Douglas. Oh, that's over half. We talk about Andersonville and the atrocities there, and they hanged Captain Wirtz for what happened at Andersonville Prison on the Confederate side, but the winners aren't going to hang anyone, and especially if the president's brother-in-law is the one supposed to be providing the food. Well, how do 7,000 prisoners die? Are they malnourished? Are they starving? either way, it's an atrocity. It's a war crime to have these 7,000 men die. And I'm not a revisionist. I'm not a lost cause apologist. But the facts are there. You lose 7 out of 12,000 prisoners. It was horrific. Well, here's the training camp commandants at Camp Butler. You can see, and they'll be there for a few weeks up to a few months. Basically, they're if you're in charge of your unit training and you're the highest ranking officer there, you're the commandant. A few months and you go. So Colonel S.G. Hicks comes in, he leaves. Captain T.G. Pitcher comes in. This colonel, that colonel, this lieutenant colonel, this major, all the way through up to 1865. So there is a good record of all the training camp commandants. Here's the record of the POW camp commandants. It doesn't exist that we can find. So they say that success has a lot of parents, but failure is an orphan. No one wants to have their name on paper that they were the commandants of the POW camp. Here's a typical training day at Camp Butler for the Union regiments. You get up at 5 a.m., 5:30 you have roll call, 6 o'clock you police the camp. We're going to find out later there wasn't much policing that went on at this camp. Breakfast at 6:30, squad drill at 7:30, guard drill at 9, battalion drill at 11, noon at lunch, and I guess you get to eat and rest for 2 hours. Pretty nice. Battalion drill from 2 to 5, dress parade at 5, supper and recreation at 6, evening roll call at 9. Here's all the units that trained at Camp Butler. If they're, we skip from the 68th to the 70th Regiment. The 69th Regiment could have been a county seat regiment, or it could have been up at Camp Douglas. But here's all the infantry regiments. Here's the 4 cavalry regiments that trained there, and then here's the different artillery batteries that trained there. Here's what squad drill was, basically led by sergeants or corporals. There was a guard drill ceremony of changing the guard. Battalion drills ran by officers using Hardee's tactics, form the lines, advance, retreat, charge. A lot of physical fitness, a lot of marching, but only 5.5 hours a day of training. Well, they claim that pneumonia was the #1 killer at Camp Butler, both of Union and Confederate soldiers, but there's other records that indicate that there was smallpox epidemics and just horrible. There's typhoid, there's smallpox, there's typhus, there's common fever, as it described then, which could have been malaria. And it afflicted Federals and Confederates, but not proportionally. Remember, there's 80,000 Confederate troops that trained there. 80,000 Federal troops that trained there, but only about 700 deaths. Well, there's about 3,000 to 4,000 Confederate prisoners, but there's 800 Confederate deaths. Some historians say, well, these poor Southern boys, they're not used to the weather, and they got pneumonia, they're not used to the cold. I don't think that's true. It gets cold in the South as well. And they were supposed to have had barracks according to the records, but we'll get to that in a moment. The trainees from Camp Butler, they'd go to Cairo, they'd go to St. Louis, they'd go to Quincy primarily, and primarily fought in the West. Let's talk about the POW camp for a second. Here's a picture of some newly arrived POWs at Camp Butler in front of the stockade fence. They don't look malnourished to me. They don't look ill-clad to me. They do look not very happy, which you can imagine. But this narrative that they're starving and they're ill-clothed and they're in bad shape when they get here, this photo doesn't seem to indicate that. This is supposed to be a picture of the POW camp. I think it's from the POW camp looking into the training camp, looking from west to east. And then the river is down the hill, the Sangamon River there. That looks like the training camp there and the barracks for the training camp. I don't think that they built any barracks for the POWs, but here's another view of it. So they built the POW camp, 15 acres on the northwest corner of the camp. The first prisoners arrived February of 1862. 2,000 of the 15,000 prisoners from Fort Donelson. The rest went to Alton and up to Camp Douglas. By April, those 2,148 are dead. April 1862, another 1,000 come in from Island Number 10. Now, there were 4,500 troops captured at Island Number 10. John Pope claimed he captured 7,000. Now, John Pope, we always said, oh, he's inflated these numbers to make himself look better. Maybe, maybe not. 1,000 are supposed to come in from Island Number 10. The other 3,500, again, could have gone to Alton. They could have gone to Camp Douglas. They could have gone to other places. By 1862, these are exchanged out, and then by 1863, early 1863, another 1,665 come in. Spring of 1863, there's 500 various others. Last prisoners are really gone by May of 1863. The narrative that I saw said there were barracks for 5,000 prisoners, and that after the first 2,000 prisoners, the rest were housed in tents. Well, we built barracks for 5,000 prisoners. Why are we housing them in tents? Either we built barracks or we didn't. Either way is bad. If we built barracks for 5,000 prisoners, there's some missing numbers there. This purports to be the POW camp. I actually think it's the training camp barracks, and I think the POW camp was west of here. If you look at where the Confederate burials are at Camp Butler today, and you look at where the railroad tracks are, you know, the narrative says that the Confederates were buried in a cornfield east of the training camp. Well, if you look at it proportionally, it makes sense that this picture here is not the POW camp, but it's the training camp. I don't think they built barracks for the prisoners, personally. Let's talk about the hospital fund and the prisoners fund. The hospital fund is set up to sell the property of deceased prisoners used for the sole benefit of sick prisoners, used to purchase all articles necessary for the sanitary conditions of the hospital. The prisoners fund is made by withholding all rations that could be spared without inconvenience to the prisoners, and then selling the non-issued portion to the commissary, used to purchase all essential articles for the health and comfort of the prisoners, but it could also be used for extra pay for the clerks who had charge of the camp post office. So I want you to think about this. You have incentive to inflate the number of prisoners that are there by underreporting your deaths, right? Oh, we're going to get all these extra rations for all these guys. They're dead. So you got 500 dead prisoners. You get 500 extra rations. You can sell them back to the commissary, right? You have a financial incentive to withhold food from these prisoners. You have a financial incentive to underreport your deaths. You have a financial incentive for abuse and for fraud and for waste. The hospital fund at Camp Butler rapidly accumulated as the mortality of the camp was quite high. After providing the necessary articles for the sick there, the rest was used to build an addition to the City Hospital, Indianapolis, Indiana. So there's so many dead prisoners, you've got so much money, you can build an addition to a hospital in Indiana. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Well, the first prisoners arrive in February. The fence is not built till May. There's 203 documented instances of successful escapes. Basically, the soldiers that are there guarding them don't care that much. They're there to train and go off to war. They say 339 were released upon taking the oath of allegiance. Now, keep in mind, Springfield is a southern town. The pattern of migration to Springfield, just like, Lincoln. Lincoln was born in Kentucky. Mary Todd was born in Kentucky. It is basically Southerners in that part of Illinois, and there's a lot of Southern sympathizers there. And so if a Confederate soldier would escape, he could expect that there'd be people in town that would help him. Well, the commissary is responsible for giving prisoners the same rations as the Union troops. They're supposedly allowed to receive packages and letters. They can't receive money. Sick prisoners were allowed visitors, and supposedly most of them died from weather-related pneumonia. Supposedly. I think they died of malnourishment, but that's my opinion. Prisoners received clothing from rejected Union troops, rejected Union uniforms, in other words, cast-offs and seconds. There was an inspection that came, and the inspectors said of the Confederate prisoners, their good treatment has made them so indolent that they were satisfied to remain in filth and vermin, showing a decided want of energy. In other words, we treated them so good, and that's why they lived in filth and they had lice. And they just didn't have any energy. Well, I can't imagine why. Well, the official narrative is, yeah, but the rains made the roads kind of tough, and we needed wagons to haul firewood. We didn't have enough wagons. We didn't have enough wells. And Sangamon River water wasn't really good for consumption. Trust me, it's not good for consumption today. And, they were exposed to the weather when they were transported, and we had overcrowded prisoner barracks. The lack of blankets, lack of fresh straw. Well, if we built barracks for 5,000 Confederate soldiers, we shouldn't have had an overcrowding, because we never had as many as 5,000 Confederate prisoners at Camp Butler. So that leads me to think they got in way more prisoners than we know of. So J. Cooper McKee, the army doctor, he inspects it. He finds filthy barracks floors. He finds filth everywhere on the ground. He finds that the drainage is not good. So what happened to that half-hour police call these troops are supposed to be doing every day? There's a smallpox outbreak in 1863 that caused 53 Confederate deaths and 53 federal deaths and 50 Confederate deaths. There's a National Cemetery Administration website that says this smallpox outbreak caused 700 Confederate deaths. If that's to be believed, then smallpox was the biggest killer. In April 1863, there's 1,700 prisoners there, and we begin to exchange out our last prisoners on April 7th. 600 go to City Point, Virginia. April 13th, the last prisoners leave, except for 134 that were sick. The sick prisoners leave May 19th, 1863. So let's think about this. At its peak, there's 3,000 prisoners. 1,700 transferred out. 866 are buried. That leaves 414 that we don't know about. There were some escapes. I don't know that there's many escapes as they say that there was, but it's convenient to say they escaped, and the records were lost. So oral testimony says there was capacity for 5,000 prisoners in barracks, but some had to live in tents. So why do I build a 5,000 capacity barracks for 3,000 prisoners and say the cause of death is due to overcrowding? So either we had way more prisoners that came in, or we never built barracks. Either way, it's bad in the wintertime for these guys. But if we had way more prisoners that came in, we have some idea of who transferred out. That means a lot more came in than came out. That means there's a lot more Confederate dead at Camp Butler than we know about. So 12,000 prisoners were taken at Donelson. 8,000 went to Camp Douglas. 4,000 should have come to Camp Butler, not 2,000. Yes, I know some probably went to Alton. There were 4,500 Confederates at Island Number 10. 1,000 came to Camp Butler, but again, Polk claimed he had 7,000 prisoners. So either there was no barracks ever built, or we have thousands of prisoners unaccounted for. My hypothesis, and I will say it bears further research. I think there's a book or a doctoral dissertation in this somewhere. I think there were far more Confederate deaths than 886. Camp Douglas's proportion of dead is much higher and had the same commissary serving them. They had 7,000 out of 12,000 dead. There's 1,354 at Alton, and that doesn't even include those who died on Smallpox Island, right? So maybe even more than that at Alton. So if Camp Butler only had 886 dead, they would be an anomaly among Civil War prisons in Illinois. Well, Camp Butler continues to be a demobilization camp. It's a hospital for the released Union prisoners of war. By 1874, all but the 6 acres that they had bought for a cemetery was returned back to private ownership. So the history of the cemetery here, it gets formed. Initially, the chain of command is responsible for burials, but sometimes the chain of command was dead. It's a lot of effort to move those human remains, and it's sometimes not practical to dig these graves. So Congress passes in 1862 a law to establish 12 national cemeteries, and Camp Butler is one of the original 12. Arlington is not. Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis is not. But Camp Butler is. The camp closes for training in 1866 and closes for demobilization, but the cemetery is there. So here's the original 12 cemeteries. Some of these make sense, like Leavenworth and the Soldiers' Home. Others are a little bit more obscure. In 1867, Congress passes the Act to establish and protect national cemeteries. It's got to be enclosed with a stone or an iron fence. Every grave's got to be marked. A superintendent has got to be appointed, and each superintendent has to have a house. By 1873, any U.S. Civil War veteran can be buried in a national cemetery, later expanded to include anyone honorably discharged, their spouses, their dependent children. So initially, it's just the 6 acres around the Union and Confederate burials, purchased in September of 1865. Over the years, that was expanded to 53 acres, and there's some more recent, really interesting news. A picture of the superintendent's house, which is today the office for the cemetery. That building is still standing. So there's 1,642 Civil War soldiers buried there. 866 Confederate, so they say, with permanent markers erected in 1908. Now, there were wooden markers. There were different evolutions of markers in between there, but the markers you see today were put up in 1908. 766 Federal. Not all were dead while they were training at Camp Butler. Some were died on the battlefield, embalmed, and brought back to Springfield. But if you look at those proportions, if you have 3,000 total Confederate soldiers and 866 of them are dead, still a pretty high amount of deaths, considering 80,000 Federal troops trained there and 766 are dead, and that's not even just the people that trained. That's also died in battle and brought back. Today there's about 25,000 internments, and there are plans for expansion. Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis has about 10 times that, or about 250,000. They have veterans of every conflict. Here's the Confederate monument to the Confederate prisoners that are buried there. And here are the Confederate graves today. And you can see there's some spots in there. 9 of these people were disinterred and moved back to their hometowns. I'll tell you about my thesis here. In 1906, Congress adopts a regulation for the Confederate gravestone. Same size and material, but it's got to have a pointed instead of a rounded top to distinguish them. Not designed to keep the Yankees from sitting on the headstones. That's a myth. My best thesis is that, yes, where the Confederate burial is at Camp Butler is the Confederate burial, but that nice one headstone to one internment is probably somewhat of a fiction. I don't think they're exactly sure who is where, but they've got the gravestones there. But I think there's several hundred more burials there than the 800 and some that are officially told about. Again, it bears further research. I'm not saying I have the evidence for it. I'm just saying the numbers seem awful fishy. Here's the Union graves at Camp Butler that you can go visit to this day. Here's some notable burials. Otis Beverly Duncan, the highest rating African-American officer in World War I. His grave says he was a lieutenant colonel. He was actually a colonel. The 370th Infantry Regiment, which is originally the 8th Illinois, the only African-American regiment to serve in combat in World War I. They did not serve with the American forces. They served with the French 10th Army. So if you remember, John Pershing said, I want my units all to serve under American commanders. This was one of the exceptions. And he won the Purple Heart and the Croix de Guerre. Here's his headstone, which is not regulation Army headstone. It's a non-standard headstone. John Catherwood is buried there. He was exhumed from Oak Ridge Cemetery in 1987. He was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Philippine conflict. There's 34 German and Italian World War II POWs and 1 Korean. And there's 166 unknown burials at Camp Butler. This Korean gentleman, as you can see, was died in 1943 as part of World War II. He was a Korean national fighting in the Japanese army. The present status of Camp Butler as a historical point of interest is eclipsed by the Lincoln Shrines and Springfieldians' interest in the great humanitarian. Of the thousands who visit Lincoln's home and tomb, only a very small percent of them know anything about Camp Butler or visit it. When strangers visit Camp Butler, either by accident or curiosity, they are impressed with the beauty and simplicity of the place. I told you guys I had some more news. The oval there is the area of the Civil War burials. The box there and the green is the current cemetery, and kind of that brownish area is land that's been cleared off because it's been recently acquired for future expansion of the cemetery, reacquired in 2019, another 9.5 acres. Today, to the south of Camp Butler, there's a civilian cemetery, there's houses. Further south, there's a country club golf course. To the east, there's a farms and bottomlands. There's a mobile home park, there's some cropland, and Interstate 72 basically runs right through the middle of the old Camp Butler training ground. My maternal grandparents are buried there. My maternal grandfather served in World War I. My mom's sister and her husband are buried there. Her husband served in the Marines during the Vietnam era. My parents plan to be buried there. With Boy Scouts, I planted flags on Memorial Day at Camp Butler every Memorial Day weekend. And I lived on the training grounds and didn't even know it till I did research for this from the time I was about 2 till the time I was about 3rd grade. Then we moved into town, into Riverton, what was used to be called Jamestown at the time. And our house backed up to the old Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific line that ran Union soldiers in and out. This may explain why I'm a Civil War guy today, because I lived on the training camp. Here's my grandparents and my aunt and uncle's graves at Camp Butler. On the left, Roy Scott, who's my maternal grandfather. On the back is my grandmother's name. And Charles Lutz, who was married to my mom's sister, and her name is on the back of that gravestone. So I lived right here where the red circle is from the time I was 2 to the time I was 3rd grade. So I guess this is in my blood a little bit, but that's why I chose to pick this. Here's some of my references. You can pause and look at this, and VA administration, etc. So I'd like to thank you for watching this, and I'd like to thank you for being interested in the Civil War Roundtable of St. Charles County.